Almost every famous life is remembered for the wrong length of time. A person is born, grows, works, marries, quarrels, recovers, ages and dies across 7 or 8 decades, and then history selects a single afternoon out of the whole of it and keeps that instead. The afternoon becomes the person. Everything else, the ordinary mornings, the letters, the arguments about furniture, the years in which nothing happened at all, is quietly discarded because it does not carry a moral and cannot be painted. There is a woman in this story who has been reduced, for more than a century, to about 3 minutes. The 3 minutes take place at a ship's rail on a windless, bitterly cold night in the middle of the North Atlantic, in the second week of April, 1912. A boat is being lowered. An officer has offered her a place in it. She is 63 years old, and she is standing in a fur coat with one foot already on the gunwale. What she does next is the most reproduced gesture of that entire night, and it is the only thing about her that anyone can tell you. Her name was Ida. She was born in a Rhineland town on the Rhine Plain, the daughter of a merchant family, and she had at that point been married for 41 years to a man who had arrived in America at the age of 9 speaking no English, and who now owned, with his brother, the largest shop on earth. His name was Isidor Straus. When they were apart, and his business took him away frequently, the two of them wrote to each other every single day. That correspondence is the real subject of what follows, because the gesture at the rail was not a decision made in 3 minutes. It was the last item in a very long ledger, and everything that made it inevitable happened years earlier, in Georgia and in London and in a basement on 14th Street, and almost none of it is remembered. Subscribe for more documentaries on the great dynasties of old money. New episodes every week. What follows is the whole length of 2 lives. A bankrupt German seed merchant who put his family on a ship, a boy who sailed through a naval blockade with his savings sewn into his underclothes, a household in the American South that opposed secession and profited from slavery at the same time, a crockery counter in a basement that became a department store, a brother who gave away a fortune on milk, and a marriage of 41 years that ended in the space of a few minutes on a boat deck. And at the end of it, a memorial on a traffic island on the Upper West Side, where the water in the urn was carried up from the place the ship went down. The town was called Otterburg, and it sits in the Rhenish Palatinate, a wine and grain country then governed from Munich as part of the Kingdom of Bavaria. Lazarus Straus was born there in 1809. He dealt in seed and grain, he was respected, he read, and he held opinions about liberty that were common among educated German men of his generation and dangerous for them to hold. When the revolutions of 1848 swept across the German states and then collapsed, the political consequences fell on people like him, and the economic consequences fell harder. His business failed. He was 43 years old, with a wife and 4 surviving children, in a country where the door had just closed. In 1852, he emigrated alone. He landed at Philadelphia, which was then the center of German Jewish settlement in America, and was advised by other immigrants from his own district that a man could do better in the South. So he went south to Oglethorpe in Georgia and did the thing that thousands of German Jewish immigrants of that decade did, which was to take a pack and a wagon and go out to the plantations as a peddler. It is worth pausing on that image because the Straus story is normally told from the Herald Square end. A man of 43, a merchant in his own country, who had employed people and kept accounts and owned a house, was now walking the red clay roads of West Georgia, selling needles and cloth out of a wagon in a language he was still learning. Within 2 years, he had a shop. The town was Talbotton, the county seat of Talbot County, a place of a few hundred people at the center of a cotton district. He chose it partly because it had a private school for boys and another for girls, and Lazarus Straus believed in education with the particular intensity of a man who had lost everything else. In 1854, he sent for his family. Sarah Straus and the children crossed the Atlantic and traveled down to Georgia to join him. The eldest was 9 years old. That was Isidor. They were the only Jewish family in the county. This is the part of the story that resists a simple telling, and any honest account has to slow down here. By every surviving description, the Strauses were welcomed. Lazarus was liked. He discussed religion, at length and apparently with pleasure, with the local Protestant ministers. The two younger boys attended the Baptist Sunday school with the other children of the town, which was not regarded by anybody as remarkable. The sons were educated at the academy nearby. The family became, in the language of the historical marker that stands on the site today, identified with the progress of the community. They were also living in a county in which more than half the population was enslaved, in an economy that existed for cotton among customers who owned people. The scholarship on the family is careful and specific about what followed, and it does not flatter anyone. Lazarus Straus did not support slavery as a principle and did not favor secession. He also conducted his business with slaveholders, because there was no other business to conduct, and the household hired enslaved people from their owners and eventually held them. Sarah Straus had lost the use of one arm after a stroke and needed help in the house. Isidore's younger brother Oscar, who became a diplomat and wrote his memoirs in old age, recorded that some of those people asked the family to purchase them because they preferred the Strauses to their existing owners. That sentence contains an entire moral universe, and it should be left to sit rather than explained away. What it demonstrates is the thing every one of these family histories eventually demonstrates, which is that the people in them are not arranged into the good and the wicked. A man who had fled a failed revolution because he believed in liberty was within a decade in a household organized on the labor of people who had none, and he appears to have understood the contradiction perfectly well and to have accommodated it anyway, in the way that almost everybody accommodates the arrangements of the place they have arrived in. It is also worth understanding what that household actually looked like, because the temptation is to imagine either a plantation or a hovel, and it was neither. Lazarus Straus ran a general store in a county seat. He sold cloth, tools, seed, boots, hats, thread, and household goods to farmers and to the wives of planters, largely on credit against the cotton crop, which meant that his fortunes rose and fell with a harvest he had no part in. The family lived in a small frame house. The boys walked to the academy nearby. They were the only Jewish family for a considerable distance, which meant no synagogue, no community, no congregation, and the household kept what it could of its observance privately and got on with the rest. The two younger boys attended the Baptist Sunday school. That detail has been repeated in every account of the family for a century, usually with a certain warmth, and it is genuinely revealing. Not of tolerance exactly, but of the particular arrangement of the rural 19th century South, in which a family could be entirely accepted and entirely other at the same time, and in which the acceptance was contingent on there being only one such family. Isidore's own memoir of those years, printed privately for his children long afterwards, describes a boyhood that sounds like any other boyhood in a cotton town. The horses, the court weeks when the whole county came into town, the summer heat, his father's opinions delivered at length across a dinner table. He was, by his own account, happy there. That is the context in which the household's entanglement with slavery has to be read. It was not the entanglement of the owner of a large estate. It was the entanglement of a shopkeeper who had arrived from Bavaria 8 years earlier, whose customers held people, whose wife could not manage house with one arm, and who did what the people around him did, which is not an excuse and is the reason the thing was so difficult to dislodge. Then the war came, and the welcome thinned. At the outbreak in 1861, Isidore was 16. He tried to enlist. He was turned away for his age, which he found humiliating, and which almost certainly saved his life. Within 2 years, the atmosphere in Talbotton had changed. A judge in the county began questioning, in public and from the bench, the loyalty of the local Jewish merchants to the Confederate cause, a suspicion that fell on traders generally in a starving wartime economy, and on Jewish traders specifically, and which was raised nowhere in the county except against the one family it could be raised against. In 1863, the Strauses left for Columbus, 40 miles away, a larger town with an established Jewish community. They did well there. And when the war ended in 1865, much of Columbus was burned. By then, Isidore was in London and had been for 2 years. He had gone in 1863, at 18 years old, as an aide to a Confederate agent. The particulars are not disputed, and there is no purpose in softening them. He sailed out of Charleston on a ship that ran the Union blockade, with his savings, $1,200 in gold, sewn into his undershirt. He crossed to Europe, spent some months with relatives in the Bavarian village where he had been born, and then settled in London, where the Confederate government maintained a purchasing and financing operation abroad. His work was commercial rather than military. He assisted in the effort to procure blockade-running ships, and he sold Confederate bonds in London and in Amsterdam to European investors who believed, for a period, that the South would win. The plan he had gone for was eventually abandoned, and he was left in a foreign capital, 18 years old, with his gold and no instructions. What he did then is the first clear sight of the man he would become. He went to work in the London financial markets, and by the end of the war, he had turned $1,200 into something in the order of $12,000. He also used his position to buy goods directly from European manufacturers and ship them home, without brokers and without the state, which taught him at 19 the lesson that would define his entire commercial life, that the money is in cutting out the man in the middle. Now consider the shape of what had happened. A German Jewish teenager whose father had fled a reactionary Europe in the name of liberty, had spent the American Civil War in London selling the bonds of the slave-holding South, and had come out of it with a private fortune. It is worth being exact about what that work was, since the family's own later accounts pass over it briskly and most retellings skip it entirely. The Confederacy could not finance a war from a cotton economy under naval blockade. What it did instead was borrow in Europe against the cotton it could not ship, issuing bonds redeemable in cotton at a price well below the market, sold to investors in London, Paris, and Amsterdam, who were betting that the South would survive long enough to deliver. For a period in the middle of the war, those bonds traded strongly because a great many respectable people in Europe expected the Confederacy to win, and because European mills were desperate for the cotton. Selling them was the work of young men in offices. It was not violent, it was not secret in any dramatic sense, and it was regarded at the time by the people doing it as commerce. It was also, in the plainest description, the raising of money to sustain a government fighting for the right to own human beings, performed by a boy of 18 whose household had itself held enslaved people and who had been turned down for the army only because of his age. He never publicly repudiated it. He also never made anything of it. In the private memoir he printed for his family in later life, he set down the Georgia years and the London years, without evasion and without pride, as things that had happened to him. And then he went on with the account of the shop. That is worth registering because there is a version of the American immigrant story in which the arriving family is morally weightless, a clean slate, acted upon by the country rather than acting in it. The Straus record refuses that comfort. They arrived, they took the terms of the place they landed in, they were harmed by those terms when the suspicion turned on them in 1863, and they profited by them before and after. They were participants. He was 20 years old. He returned to a family whose town had burned and whose southern life was finished, and he made the decision that determined everything afterwards. They would not rebuild in Georgia. They would go north. In 1865, the Straus family arrived in New York City. Lazarus and Isidore established an importing business in crockery, china, porcelain, and glassware, and called it L. Straus and Sons. Nobody in the family at that date had anything to do with a department store. 4 years earlier, and 3,000 miles away, in Worms on the Rhine, another German Jewish merchant family had been raising daughters. Rosalie Ida Blum was born there on the 6th of February, 1849. The date matters for a small reason that the couple themselves evidently enjoyed. Isidore Straus had been born on the 6th of February 4 years before her. Husband and wife shared a birthday. The Blums came to America as the Strauses had, in the middle of the century, out of the same Rhineland and for the same reasons, and settled in New York. They were comfortable, educated, and part of the German Jewish community that was in the process of building the institutions of Jewish New York. The synagogues, the hospitals, the charitable societies, the network of intermarried commercial families, out of which the next generation of American retailing would come almost entirely. Ida was 22 when she married Isidore Straus in 1871. He was 26, 3 years back from London, working in his father's crockery firm. They had 7 children over the following decade. Jesse arrived in 1872 and would end his life as the American ambassador to France. Clarence was born in 1874 and died before he was 2, the loss that the family did not afterward discuss, and which shaped Ida's ferocity about her remaining children. Percy came in 1876, Sarah in 1878, Minnie in 1880, Herbert in 1881, and Vivian last. And from very near the beginning they wrote, "The habit is documented, it is unusual, and it is the single most important fact about the marriage." When Isidor Straus traveled, and he traveled a great deal, buying in Europe, opening outlets in Chicago and Boston and Philadelphia, later serving in Washington, he wrote to his wife every day. She wrote back every day. Not weekly bulletins, not the formal correspondence of a Victorian couple performing affection for posterity. Daily letters over 4 decades about the weather and the children and the state of his digestion and what she had done in the afternoon. Hundreds of them survive. What they show is not a grand romance in the operatic sense. It is something rarer and considerably harder to sustain, which is 2 people who were mildly but permanently unhappy when they were not in the same building, and who dealt with it by writing. There is an aphorism worth resisting here about love conquering distance. The truer observation is duller and better. 41 years of a marriage in which neither party ever quite got used to the other's absence is not a story about passion. It is a story about habit, which is the only form of devotion that survives contact with an ordinary life. The shop that made them was not theirs, and for a long time they were not even tenants in it. They were a concession in the cellar. R.H. Macy and Company had been founded on 6th Avenue in 1858 by Roland Hussey Macy, a Nantucket man who had been to sea on a whaler in his youth, had failed at retail 4 separate times in Massachusetts, and who put a red star on his shop because he had one tattooed on his hand. He sold dry goods for cash at fixed prices, undercutting his competitors. He died in 1877, and the business passed out of the founding family's hands by degrees. Macy is worth a moment because the 2 principles that made the Strauses rich were his before they were theirs. He had gone to sea at 15 on a whaling voyage out of Nantucket, which in that trade meant 3 or 4 years away and a share of the oil at the end of it, and he came home with the tattoo and a small amount of capital. He then failed. He opened a shop in Boston and failed. He opened another and failed. He went to California in the gold rush and ran a store there and failed at that too. He was in his middle 30s, 4 times bankrupt, when he tried once more in New York. What he had worked out across those failures was that a small shop cannot beat a large one on selection and cannot beat it on credit, but can beat it on price if it refuses credit altogether and turns its stock fast enough. So he took cash only, marked everything plainly, advertised aggressively, and undersold the street. That was the machine the Strauses inherited, and Isidor's contribution was not to invent it, but to run it at a scale its creator could never have financed. In the middle of the 1870s, Nathan Straus, the second brother, then in his middle 20s and the salesman of the family, persuaded Macy to let L. Straus & Sons open a crockery, glass, and silverware department in the basement of the 14th Street store. The accounts differ by a year on when exactly the counter opened, and it does not much matter. What matters is what happened to it. Within a short time, the basement department was accounting for something in the region of 1/10 of the entire store's sales. That is an extraordinary figure, and it is the hinge of the whole family history. A concession selling plates in a cellar was outperforming whole floors of a New York dry goods house. For one reason, the Strauses were importers. They bought their stock at the source in Europe. They later manufactured some of it themselves, and they carried none of the layered markups that everybody else in the trade was paying. They could sell a dinner service for less than their competitors paid for it wholesale and still make money. Isidor had learned that in London at 19, and he spent the next 40 years applying it at increasing scale. In 1888, the 2 brothers became partners in the firm. In 1896, they bought out the last outside interest and owned R.H. Macy and Company outright. Along the way, in 1893, They took a half share in a Brooklyn dry goods house and renamed it Abraham and Straus. Two brothers who had arrived in the country as immigrant children now controlled two of the largest retail businesses in New York and had done it in 30 years. The division of labor between them was settled early and never seriously disturbed. Isidore was the organization, the accounts, the buying, the structure, the discipline. Nathan was the idea, the enthusiasm, the man who could sell anything and who was liked instantly by everybody he met. What Isidore Straus actually did to Macy's is not romantic, and it changed American life more than most of the events that get documentaries made about them. He built a store around a single principle, that the shop should undersell everybody permanently and make its money on volume and speed. That meant no credit, cash only, which kept capital turning and eliminated the risk that ruined half the retail trade in every downturn. It meant fixed prices, publicly displayed, with no haggling and no discretion for the salesman, which, exactly as it had for the great jewelers of the period, removed the humiliation from buying. And it meant odd pricing, goods marked at figures just under the round number, a device Macy's used relentlessly and which is now so universal that no shopper in the world notices it. He employed a standing team of comparison shoppers whose entire job was to walk into rival stores, note their prices, and report back so that Macy's could be certain of being cheaper by the end of the week. And he advertised, heavily and cleverly, at a time when a great many respectable merchants still regarded advertising as slightly vulgar. The result was a shop for people who counted their money. That is the thing usually lost about Macy's in this period. The Gilded Age palaces of retail on Ladies' Mile were selling an experience of luxury to the carriage trade. Macy's was selling a decent kettle to a clerk's wife for 11 cents less than anybody else, and it grew faster than any of them. The department store as an institution was, in those decades, doing something to American life that nobody had planned and that took a generation to become visible. It created, almost accidentally, the first large public space in the American city where a respectable woman could go alone. That sentence is easy to read past, and it should not be. In the 1870s, a middle-class woman in New York had almost nowhere she could spend an afternoon unaccompanied without comment. Not a restaurant, not a club, not a bar, not an office. The great stores changed that within 20 years. They installed restrooms and writing rooms and tea rooms and information counters. They made it possible to arrive at 11, spend 6 hours, eat, meet a friend, use a lavatory, and go home, and to do all of it without a male escort and without a single moment of social exposure. They also became the largest employers of women in the city. The shop floor of a great store was one of the few places where a young woman without capital or family connections could earn a wage in clean surroundings. And the conditions in which she did it, the hours, the standing, the fines, the rules, became one of the first great subjects of American labor reform. None of this was philanthropy. Isidore Straus built restrooms and dining halls because they kept customers in the building and staff at their counters. But the effect was real and it outran the intention, which is how most social change actually happens. The fixed price did something similar. A shop where the number on the ticket is the number everybody pays is a shop where a recently arrived immigrant with imperfect English cannot be quietly charged more than the woman ahead of her in the queue. The Strauses did not introduce that practice and did not invent it. They enforced it at enormous scale in a city that was in the middle of absorbing 1 million people who had every reason to expect to be cheated. There is a quiet symmetry in this that the family never articulated and probably never noticed. Lazarus Straus had begun in America walking between plantations with a wagon, selling small necessities to people who had no shop within 30 miles. His son built the largest retail organization in the world doing an industrialized version of exactly the same thing. The store also became, under both brothers, an unusually decent employer for the period. There was a dining hall where a full meal cost 5 cents. There was a mutual aid society. There were gifts of money and clothing and medical treatment to employees in trouble, given personally, which in the New York of the 1890s was not standard practice, and in a great many houses would have been thought a dangerous precedent. That instinct came mostly from Nathan, and in Nathan it went a great deal further than the shop floor. The second brother is the reason this family belongs in a series about wealth rather than merely in a series about shipwrecks, and his arc is the one almost nobody knows. Nathan Straus was born in Otterburg in 1848 and came to Georgia as a small child. He made his fortune in the same business as his brother, and by the 1890s he was, in the ordinary sense, finished, rich, respected, in his 40s with public offices arriving as they do. He was appointed Parks Commissioner of New York City. He was later made president of the city's Board of Health. In 1894, the Democratic machine offered him the nomination for mayor, which in that city and that decade was very close to the office itself. He declined it. The reason he gave afterwards is one of the small human details that survives the century intact. He withdrew because friends of his in society let him understand that they would not receive a man who had taken the nomination from Tammany Hall. He was, in other words, talked out of the mayoralty of New York by his own dinner invitations, and he appears to have regretted it for the rest of his life. What redirected him was not politics. It was the deaths of his children. Nathan and Lena Straus lost 3 of their children in the 1870s and 1880s. At least one of those deaths was believed in the family to have been caused by contaminated milk. And then, in the early 1890s, a cow on his own farm, a healthy animal, so far as anyone could see, dropped dead. He ordered an examination, and the lungs came back riddled with tuberculosis. He understood immediately what he was looking at, and he spent the remaining 40 years of his life on it. The situation in the American cities of that decade is difficult to convey without descending into a recitation of figures. So it is enough to say that milk sold in the tenements was frequently drawn from diseased animals, transported without refrigeration, watered, adulterated, and given to infants, and that the mortality among children under 1-year-old in the poorest districts of New York was of an order that no modern city would tolerate for a week. Pasteurization had been understood in Europe for close to 30 years. The dairy trade did not want it because it cost money, and the public authorities were slow because the dairy trade did not want it. So Nathan Straus built the plants himself. In 1893, he opened the first of his milk depots in New York at his own expense. Pasteurized milk, bottled in his own sterilized bottles, sold for a few cents to families who could pay, and given free to families who could not. There were 18 of them in the city. In time, there were close to 300 stations across 36 American cities and others in Europe, and he funded them for a quarter of a century. He lectured. He wrote to mayors and governors and health boards until they stopped answering, and then wrote again. His argument was not that a rich man should provide safe milk. It was that a government should, and that his stations existed only to embarrass the authorities into taking them over, which in the end is what happened. The opposition he met is the part of the story that dates the least well and explains the most. The dairy trade fought him for 2 decades, and it fought him with arguments that anyone who has watched a modern public health controversy will recognize instantly. Pasteurization, it was said, destroyed the natural goodness of milk. It was an unnecessary interference with a wholesome food. It would raise prices and hurt the poor, on whose behalf the trade suddenly discovered a great tenderness. It was a scheme by a department store owner with something to sell, and it was, in a formulation that recurred in the trade press, the imposition of a foreign process on an honest American product. Some physicians opposed him too, in good faith, on the grounds that heating milk altered it in ways not yet fully understood. Straus answered by building the plants and publishing the results year after year in whatever form would print them. When he was made president of the city's Board of Health, he donated the pasteurizing equipment to the municipal orphan asylum and let the mortality figures make the argument for him. He was not a scientist and never pretended to be. What he had was a very large amount of money, a merchant's understanding that a demonstration beats a pamphlet, in the particular obstinacy of a man who had buried 3 of his own children and had decided that other people were not going to bury theirs if he could help it. The estimates of what that campaign accomplished that are necessarily rough, and the honest figure is simply that it was very large. He was called, by the press of his own day, the most useful citizen in New York. He also gave enormously elsewhere. He funded relief after the earthquake in Italy in 1909. He built a health center in Jerusalem and stipulated that it serve every inhabitant of the country without regard to race or creed. A town founded on the coast of Palestine in 1927 took his name and carries it still. And when he died in January 1931, a few weeks short of his 83rd birthday, his will left nothing whatever to charity. That was deliberate, and he had explained it publicly years before. He had been quoting an old proverb to anybody who would listen, that what a man gives to charity and health is gold, what he gives in sickness is silver, and what he gives at his death is lead. He had given it all in health. There was nothing left to bequeath. His funeral filled a synagogue on Fifth Avenue and left thousands of people standing in the street outside. There was a third brother, and his career explains something about the family that neither the store nor the milk depots quite does. Oscar Solomon Straus was born in Otterburg in 1850 and was the baby of the household, 4 years old on the crossing, and the one who has left the fullest written account of the family because he lived long enough to write his memoirs and was vain enough in the right way to do it. He took a law degree at Columbia and never had the slightest interest in crockery. What drew him was public life, and he entered it through the reforming wing of New York politics in the 1880s. What happened to him afterwards would have been unimaginable to his father on the Talbotton Road. He was appointed the American minister to the Ottoman Empire and held the post under 3 presidents across 2 decades, a delicate assignment involving the protection of American missionaries and naturalized citizens in a collapsing empire, and one for which a Jewish diplomat was, at that particular court, an unusually effective choice. He sat on the International Arbitration Court at The Hague, and in 1906 Theodore Roosevelt made him Secretary of Commerce and Labor. He was the first Jew to sit in an American cabinet. Consider the family arithmetic. Lazarus Straus had landed at Philadelphia in 1852, a bankrupt provincial seed merchant of 43 with no English, and had gone out to the plantation roads with a wagon because it was the only work available. 54 years later, his youngest son was a member of the government of the United States. His eldest owned the largest shop in the world, and his second was refusing the mayoralty of New York City because it would have cost him his dinner invitations. 3 brothers, 1 immigrant generation, and the whole of the American promise executed almost as advertised. Oscar was also, for years, the president of the Educational Alliance, and that is where the 3 of them converged. Isidore, meanwhile, had been building the largest shop in the world and had been talked into it by his sons. By the turn of the century, the 14th Street store had run out of room. Jesse, Percy, and Herbert Straus, the 3 boys now in their 20s, and all of them in the business, pushed their father to move the whole operation uptown to Herald Square at 34th Street and Broadway. It was a considerable risk. Herald Square was so far north of the established retail district that the store had to run a horse-drawn wagonette to carry customers up from 14th Street for the first period after it opened. The new building cost something in the region of $4.5 million, raised without difficulty on the family's name. It opened in 1902, and it worked immediately. Sales passed $11 million within a year of the move. It was equipped with the newest escalators, with pneumatic tubes to carry cash and messages through the walls, with a mechanical system to keep the air fresh, with fitting rooms and restrooms and an information counter. A machine for shopping in an era when most shops were still rooms with counters in them. The press called it the largest store in the world, and for a long while it was. The move also dragged the center of New York retail a mile north with it, which is why the district sits where it does today. Isidore Straus was 57, and he had built the thing his father's wagon had been pointing at for half a century. He had also, in the middle of all this, spent a little over a year in Congress. He was a Democrat of the older, hard money, free trade kind, and a close friend of Grover Cleveland, whom he advised. The 2 men corresponded, and Straus was one of the merchants Cleveland listened to on the currency question. He filled a vacancy in a New York seat in the mid-1890s, served briefly, declined to seek the office again, and went back to the store. Politics interested him less than institutions. He was a founder and long-serving figure of the Educational Alliance on the Lower East Side, and that institution deserves rather more than a clause. The New York of the 1890s was absorbing the largest movement of people in its history. Jews were arriving from the Russian Empire and from Galicia and Romania in numbers that had no precedent, fleeing violence, conscription, and legal disability, arriving with no English, no capital, and no trade that the American economy recognized, and settling into the tenement blocks of the Lower East Side at densities that were among the worst recorded anywhere in the industrialized world. The established German Jewish families of uptown New York, the Strauses, the Schiffs, the Warburgs, the Seligmans, the Lehmans, regarded this arrival with a complicated set of emotions that historians have documented at length and that were not, on the whole, generous. They were not the same people. The uptown families were German-speaking, decades settled, largely reform in their observance, prosperous, and in the delicate middle of being accepted by an American establishment that had only lately stopped regarding them as foreign. The newcomers spoke Yiddish, were mostly Orthodox, were desperately poor, and were extremely visible. There was a genuine and widely voiced fear that the sudden appearance of 100,000 destitute Eastern Europeans would undo 30 years of quiet social progress and bring down on everybody a hostility that the uptown families had spent a generation escaping. Some responded by keeping their distance. Some funded a return passage. Others, and this is the harder and more interesting response, decided that the newcomers had to be made into Americans as quickly and thoroughly as possible, and paid for the machinery to do it. The Educational Alliance was that machinery. It taught English. It taught trades. It taught American civics and history. It ran classes, lectures, a library, a gymnasium, art instruction, and courses for mothers. It was, in the frankest terms, an assimilation engine, and its founders made no secret of that being the purpose. It is possible to look at it now and see condescension, and the condescension was certainly there. It is also true that an enormous number of people passed through those rooms, learned to read the language of the country they were living in, and got out of the tenements because of it. Isidor Straus put his name, his time, and his money into it for the last 2 decades of his life. So did Oscar. When the news came from the Atlantic in 1912, the Lower East Side turned out for him in a procession reported at tens of thousands of people. And the reason was not the department store. The Strauses did not take the other view, and they paid for the alternative. To understand the last night, it is necessary to understand what a very ordinary marriage this was. The Strauses were, by the standards of the New York in which they lived, almost eccentrically undramatic. They did not build a palace on Fifth Avenue. They did not compete for opera boxes or fight social wars over calling cards. They lived on the Upper West Side at a comfortable distance from the arena where the Astors and the Vanderbilts were spending the decade destroying one another over dinner invitations. And they seemed to have regarded the whole performance with mild bafflement. What they did instead was stay in each other's company. The children's recollections and the letters describe a household organized around 2 people who preferred to be in the same room. He consulted her about the business in detail over decades. She traveled with him whenever it was possible, which for a merchant making regular European buying trips was often. When it was not possible, the daily letter went out. There is a particular quality to that correspondence which is worth naming, because it is what makes the ending intelligible. The letters are not, for the most part, about love. They are about the small mechanics of a shared life. What he had eaten, whether his cold had improved, what the children had said, the arrangements for a journey. He complained to her about his health at length and without embarrassment. She wrote back about hers. A great deal of Ida Straus's life is invisible in the record, in the way that the lives of almost all women of her class and generation are invisible. She left no memoir. She held no office. Her charitable work was conducted through her husband's name and the family's institutions. Historians of the period have almost nothing to work with except the letters and the household accounts. What can be reconstructed is a particular kind of life, and it is worth setting out, because it is the life almost every woman in these films actually led, and almost none of them are described as leading. She ran a household of 7 children, of whom 1 died. Clarence Elias Straus was born in 1874 and did not live to be 2. There is nothing in the surviving family papers that describes what that did to her, because families of that period did not write such things down and were not expected to, and because infant death was so common that it was treated as weather. It happened in the middle of the decade in which her husband was building the crockery business into an empire, and she absorbed it while he traveled. She managed the arrangements of a large and increasingly rich family without any of the machinery that would have made her socially visible. She did not build. There is no Straus mansion in the architectural literature, no ballroom, no famous collection, no season in Newport. They lived on Weston Avenue in a house that no guidebook records, and they entertained modestly and mostly relatives. She was, by the recollections of her children, the disciplinary and emotional center of the family, and the person to whom all 7 of them reported. Her sons went into their father's business. Her daughters married doctors and lawyers of the same New York community she had grown up in. Not one of the 7 produced a scandal, which in a Gilded Age fortune of that size is close to statistically improbable and says something about how the house was run. And she traveled. That is the detail that separates her from most women of her position. She did not stay at home and receive her husband's letters from Europe. She went with him whenever the children and the calendar allowed, across the Atlantic, again and again, for 40 years. The letters exist because of the times she could not go, and those times were fewer than one would expect. She was also, on the evidence of everyone who knew them, the more frightened of the 2. She disliked being apart from him. She said so frequently, in writing over many years. That is the whole of the psychology required. There is no need to invent a grand passion. A woman who had spent 41 years being unhappy whenever her husband was in a different city was not going to get into a boat. The last winter was spent abroad. They had gone to Europe, as they had gone many times, for the sake of Isidore's health and the family's business, and they were traveling home in April 1912. With them were his manservant, John Farthing, and a young Englishwoman named Ellen Bird, whom Ida had newly engaged in England as her maid, and who was crossing the Atlantic for the first time. It was a matter of habit in the family to travel by German liner where possible. They took the new ship instead, because it was the new ship, and because the maiden voyage of the largest vessel ever built was the sort of thing that a couple in their 60s with a lifetime of Atlantic crossings behind them might reasonably want to see. Accounts of the family record that Nathan and his wife had been traveling in Europe at the same time and went home by a different ship. They boarded at Southampton on the 10th of April and were given a suite on sea deck. Isidore was 67. Ida was 63. They had been married for 41 years. Among the passengers already aboard or joining at Cherbourg were the wealthiest man on the ship and his young second wife, an American mining heir traveling with his valet, a young Philadelphia collector carrying a rare book, and a Denver woman whose name would afterwards be attached to a musical. The first-class passenger list of that voyage has been picked over for a century. The Strauses were, by wealth, somewhere in the middle of it. They dined, they walked the deck. On at least one afternoon, Isidore read aloud to his wife in their sitting room. There is nothing in the surviving accounts of those 4 days that is remarkable in any way, which is exactly what one would expect, because nobody knew anything was going to happen. It is worth staying in those 4 days a moment longer, because they are the last ordinary days of the story and the only chance to see the 2 of them at rest. They were, at that point, at the very end of the working life. He was 67 and had handed the daily running of the store substantially to his sons. The great decisions had been taken: the move uptown, the buying out of the last partners, the separation of the Brooklyn business, and what remained was the part of a merchant's life that comes after the building is finished. He had been unwell on and off for years, and the winters abroad were partly for that. They were going home to a family that had multiplied: 6 surviving children, 13 grandchildren, a house on the west side, a business that no longer needed him every morning, and the reasonable expectation of another decade. Elsewhere on the same deck, other people were also finishing something without knowing it. The wealthiest man aboard was bringing home a young second wife from a honeymoon taken abroad to escape the newspapers. A mining heir was traveling with his valet. A young collector from Philadelphia had a rare book in his luggage and a library in his future that would be built as a memorial to him rather than by him. The Strauses knew some of them slightly, in the way that first-class passengers of that period generally did. There is no record of any conversation between them that anyone thought worth writing down, which is its own small comment on how unremarkable those 4 days felt at the time. At 20 minutes to midnight on the 14th of April, in flat, calm water and clear air, the ship struck ice on her starboard side. What follows is the most exhaustively documented hour and a half in maritime history, and there is nothing to be added to the literature of it here. What matters here is a small stretch of the port side of the boat deck, in the vicinity of one particular boat. Lifeboat 8 was made ready on the port side and was lowered a little after 1 in the morning, with an able seaman in charge and roughly 24 people aboard, among them a Scottish countess who took an oar. Around it, in the freezing air, stood the group that concerns us. Something has to be said about what the boat deck was actually like at that hour, because the popular picture of it is wrong in a way that matters for what Ida Straus did. There was no panic at Lifeboat 8. It was, by every surviving account, quiet and slightly unreal. The ship was brilliantly lit and almost level. The sea was flat, there was no wind. Many of the passengers on that deck did not believe the vessel was in serious danger, and a considerable number of women declined to leave it, on the reasonable grounds that a warm ship appeared safer than an open boat being lowered 70 feet in the dark. That is why the early boats on both sides went away partly empty, and it is the single greatest reason the loss of life was what it was. So the situation Ida Straus was standing in was not a scramble for the last place. It was an officer, unhurried, urging a group of reluctant first-class passengers to get into a boat that they did not want to get into, at a moment when the general assumption was that they would all be back aboard by breakfast. Her refusal at that hour did not look like a decision to die. It looked like a woman declining an inconvenience in order to stay with her husband, which is exactly what she had been doing for 41 years, and which is why she was able to do it so quickly and so calmly. It became something else only in the last hour, and by then there were no boats. She was not the only woman aboard who made that choice. Several wives refused their seats and stayed with their husbands, and the mayor of New York would say so publicly a month later. The difference is that Ida Straus's refusal was witnessed by 24 people in a boat that got away, and one of the witnesses was a man who wrote books. Isidore and Ida Straus were there. So were Ellen Bird and John Farthing. So was Colonel Archibald Gracie, an amateur military historian traveling alone, who had befriended Isidore during the crossing, who survived the night, and who afterwards wrote the single most careful eyewitness account of the sinking that exists. Gracie's testimony is the spine of everything known about the next few minutes, and it has been corroborated and outlined by others who were in the boat. Ida Straus was urged toward the boat. She began to comply. According to the accounts, she got as far as the gunwale. Then she stopped and turned back to her husband. Gracie, seeing what was happening and judging that no officer on earth would refuse a seat to a man of 67, offered to go and ask whether Isidore might be permitted to accompany his wife. Isidore Straus refused before the question could be put. His answer, as Gracie recorded it, was that he would not go before the other men, that while there remained women and children on that ship who had not been placed in a boat, he would not take a seat in one. That refusal is the fixed point. Everything else that night for those two people followed from it, and it is worth registering that it was not a sacrifice made for his wife. It was a rule about himself, applied at the worst possible moment, by a man who had spent his life building an organization on the principle that the same terms apply to everybody. Ida then did two things. She told Ellen Bird to get into the boat, and when the young woman hesitated, she insisted. And she took off her fur coat and gave it to her, saying that she should have it to keep warm, and that she herself was not going to need it. Bird carried that coat into Lifeboat 8, wore it through the night, and was picked up by the Carpathia at 7:30 the following morning. She kept it for the rest of her life. And then Ida Straus said the sentence that has outlived everything else about her. The wording is not settled. According to some of the accounts, including the version recited at a public memorial in New York a month later, drawn from survivors' testimony, she said that they had been together a long time, that she would not leave him, and that where he went, she would go. According to others, the words were that she would not be separated from her husband, and that as they had lived, so they would die together. Several who were in the boat heard her. No two of them wrote it down identically. If any of you have access to documents that settle the exact wording, leave a comment below. What every account agrees on is the substance, and the substance took about 3 seconds to say. Boat 8 went down the side without her. The remaining record of Isidore and Ida Straus is very short. They were seen together on the boat deck. The most widely reported version, which comes from more than one witness, is that they went and sat down beside each other on a pair of deck chairs and stayed there. The ship went down a little after 2 in the morning. He was 67 and she was 63, and there is nothing further to be said about it that is not either speculation or decoration. The sea gave one of them back. Some days later, a cable ship chartered out of Halifax to recover the dead from the site brought up the body of a man, catalogued as number 96. He was identified. In the pockets were a gold and onyx locket containing photographs of his eldest children and a gold-trimmed pocket watch that had been given to him on his 43rd birthday, a quarter of a century earlier, and which had stopped. Isidore Straus was taken to Halifax, and from there to New York, and buried in a family mausoleum in Brooklyn. 16 years later, his remains were moved to a mausoleum built for the purpose at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Ida Straus was never found. Neither was John Farthing. The manservant has almost no place in the retellings, and he should have one. He had been with Isidore Straus for years. He was standing at Lifeboat 8 with the family. He was a man and therefore not offered a seat, and he did not get one, and his body was never recovered from the sea. He appears in the record as a name on a contract ticket and a line in a casualty list. Ellen Bird, who was 29 or 30 and on her first crossing, is remembered only because of the coat. Between them, the two of them represent the great silent majority of that night, the people who were in the room when something historic happened to somebody else, and who are preserved in the account only insofar as they touched the famous. The Strauses, it should be said, appear to have understood that. Ida's last instruction was to get her maid into a boat, and she gave away the only warm thing she had to make sure of it. So her children did something that has no obvious precedent. They had water brought up from the position where the ship went down, sealed it in an urn, and placed the urn in the mausoleum beside their father. On the cenotaph outside, the family had a line cut from the Song of Solomon. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. The city, meanwhile, had lost its mind about them, and it is worth understanding why. New York in the spring of 1912 was in shock and in search of a shape for it. The disaster had produced within days an enormous quantity of confused and contradictory reporting, a great deal of recrimination about the conduct of the wealthy in the boats, and an appetite for at least one story that was not shameful. That recrimination was fierce, and it was aimed squarely at people of exactly the Straus's class. The early accounts carried by American papers were full of half-verified allegations about men who had found their way into boats, about a proprietor of the line who had stepped into one, about the boats that had rowed away half full and had not gone back. Within a fortnight, the disaster had stopped being a maritime accident in the public mind and had become a question about whether wealth had bought survival. It had, in part. The figures on the proportions saved from the different classes were published, and they were not ambiguous, and they did a great deal of damage to the reputation of a great many people. Into that atmosphere came the story from Lifeboat 8, a rich man who had refused a seat while other people's wives were still on deck, and his wife who had refused hers to stay with him. It was carried on every front page in the country within a week of the survivors' landing, because it answered exactly the question the country was asking, and because it answered it in the affirmative. There is no suggestion whatever that the story was manufactured. 24 people in a boat heard it, and one of them wrote a careful book. But the speed and the volume with which it traveled had less to do with the couple than with the national mood it arrived into. A country furious about the behavior of its rich had been handed 2 rich people who had behaved well, and it seized them with both hands and has not let go since. In May, a memorial meeting filled Carnegie Hall, at which the mayor of New York recounted the testimony of the survivors from Lifeboat 8. Thousands of people came. 40,000 were reported at a separate memorial procession on the Lower East Side, where the immigrants who had learned English at the Educational Alliance came out for the man who had paid for it. The following year, the employees of Macy's paid for a bronze tablet and put it up on the main floor of the store, where it remains. And in 1915, the city dedicated a memorial in the small triangular park near their home, at the point where Broadway crosses West End Avenue. It has a shallow basin and a reclining bronze figure representing memory, gazing at the water, modeled, as it happens, by the most photographed artist model in America at the time. The inscription is from the Book of Samuel and says that they were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. The park carries their name. Several 100,000 people a year walk past it without looking. The rest of the family did what families do. There were first the practical matters, and the newspapers reported them because in that period the newspapers reported everything. The estate was valued at something in the region of $4.5 million, which made it substantial rather than colossal by the standards of the men who had gone down with him. A working merchant's fortune rather than a dynastic one. Ida Straus left an estate of her own, in her own name, of a little over $300,000, which is a small detail with a large implication. She had held property independently, in a period when a great many wives of far richer men did not. And there were the papers. This is the reason so much of the marriage can be described at all. The family kept things, letters, photographs, scrapbooks, the privately printed memoir, the accumulated correspondence of 4 decades, and successive generations went on keeping them rather than clearing them out, which is a rarer virtue in families than it sounds. Nathan's papers went eventually to the public library of the city he had spent his fortune on. The wider family archive was gathered by a historical society founded by descendants specifically to hold it. Somewhere in those boxes are hundreds of ordinary letters about colds, dinners, journeys, and children, written by a man to his wife because he did not like being in a different city from her. They are the only reason the 3 minutes at Lifeboat 8 can be read as anything other than a gesture. The 3 sons bought out their Uncle Nathan's interest in Macy's and gave him their share of the Brooklyn store in exchange, so that the 2 houses separated cleanly. Under Jesse, Percy, and Herbert, Macy's had its greatest period of growth, a fact worth noticing because the store that made the family famous became enormous only after the man who built it was gone. The brothers were, by every account, competent and unshowy, and they ran it in their father's manner. Cash, low prices, volume, no theater. The building at Herald Square grew by successive additions until it occupied almost an entire city block, and the store passed out of the category of shop and into the category of landmark, which is a transition very few businesses survive with their character intact and which Macy's managed for a considerable time. Jesse, the eldest, left the business in the 1930s to serve as the American ambassador in Paris and died in office in 1936. Herbert died in the same decade. Percy carried on into the 1940s. And then, in the way of these families, the name receded from the thing it had made. There was no rupture, no scandal, no dramatic loss. The grandchildren went into other lives. Ownership dispersed through markets and boards and successive reorganizations, as ownership of every large American business eventually does. And the surname on the tablet inside the main entrance became a piece of history rather than a description of who was upstairs. The brothers gave a residence hall at Harvard in their parents' memory. A New York public school was later named for the couple. Jesse's son went into public service. The line continued respectably and quietly and produced, in later generations, a scattering of people in the arts and the professions who are for the most part unaware of being descended from anybody in particular. Nathan lived another 19 years, gave away everything, and died in 1931. Ellen Bird, the maid who had been on her first Atlantic crossing, lived a long life in America and then in England. According to what the family has said since, she attempted at some point to return the fur coat to the Straus children, and they would not take it. There is a difficulty with this story, and it should be stated plainly at the end rather than smuggled past. The gesture at Lifeboat 8 has been used for 114 years as a moral instrument. It appeared in sermons within a fortnight. It was painted, set in bronze, put into films in the 1950s and again in the 1990s, and set to music on a stage. It has been offered to several generations as a lesson about devotion, and more quietly as a lesson about how the rich ought to behave and mostly did not. Every one of those uses required the rest of the lives to be removed, because the couple who stood at that rail were not a parable. They were two elderly German immigrants who had made an enormous amount of money in a hard trade. Their household in Georgia had been sustained for a decade by the labor of enslaved people. Their family fortune had its first seed in a war fought to keep that arrangement in place, made by an 18-year-old selling the bonds of a government he had no obligation to serve. The store that carried them was built by undercutting competitors into failure, week after week, for 40 years, with a standing staff employed to find out exactly how far the knife could go. None of that is a scandal. It is simply what a 19th century American fortune is made of. And pretending otherwise is how a documented life turns into a stained glass window. And the refusal at the rail is not diminished by any of it. That is the point. It is made larger, because a moral act performed by a saint is a tautology, and a moral act performed by an ordinary hard commercial man at the end of a compromised life is an actual event. What the water kept was the smaller and better story. Not the tableau, which everybody has, but the 41 years of daily letters that produced it. A marriage in which two unremarkable people spent 4 decades being slightly wretched in each other's absence, and which therefore made the choice at the boat not a heroism, but a formality. She had never once in 41 years chosen to be somewhere he was not. The night in April was not an exception to that pattern. It was the last and least surprising instance of it. His brother made the opposite kind of gesture, and made it for 38 years, in milk depots in the tenements. And it saved a number of children that nobody has ever been able to count, and there is no bronze figure of him on a traffic island. There is a reason for that, and it is not injustice exactly. It is a fact about how attention works. A man who prevents a death produces nothing to look at. There is no moment, no scene, no last words, no witnesses in a boat. What Nathan Straus did was subtract a certain number of infants in a certain number of tenements in a certain number of years did not become ill, and the mothers who did not bury them never knew which particular thing had spared them and had no occasion to be grateful to anybody in particular. Prevention is invisible by construction, and it is why the men who build sewers and pasteurize milk and chlorinate water are commemorated, when they are commemorated at all, by a plaque nobody reads. The brother who died in 3 minutes got the bronze, the park, the tablet in the shop, the paintings, the films, and the century of retelling. Neither of them, on the evidence, would have thought this worth complaining about. Both men are buried in New York. One of them is remembered for 3 minutes at the end of his life. The other is remembered chiefly by a town on a distant coastline that took his name and by the people who look up what a street sign means. At Woodlawn, there is a mausoleum with a man inside it, and beside him a sealed urn of North Atlantic water, drawn from a position on a chart where a ship went down, standing in for a woman whose body the sea did not return. It is the strangest grave in New York, and one of the very few that describes a marriage accurately. 2 people in the same place, one of them entirely absent, the arrangement holding anyway. Some lives, in the end, are remembered less for the years they spent building something than for the 3 minutes in which they declined to save themselves.